Imagine a world where the simplest stories, the ones passed down seemingly forever, hold these really profound secrets about us, about society.
Absolutely. Tales that feel ancient, like whispers from the past.
Exactly. But they still pack this incredible punch today. We're exploring the surprising power behind stories you think you know inside out. Aesop's fables.
hmm
We want to go way beyond the versions you might remember from school, trace their amazing journey. How did they go from these, well, ancient whispers to a global thing? And why do they still hit home?
And what's truly remarkable, I think, is that these tales we often dismiss as just simple kids' stories. They have this incredibly rich, complex history behind them. They give us these surprising windows into human nature, into how cultures share and adapt ideas across, well, thousands of years.
Okay, let's start where most people probably do, the figure himself, Aesop. The traditional picture is this ancient Greek slave, a storyteller, living somewhere around 620 to 564 BCE. What can you tell us about him?
Well, the name Aesop, it's completely tied to the fables, no question. But, and this is important, the collection itself, sometimes called the Aesopica, its origins are actually um, pretty murky.
Murky how?
These stories started in oral tradition, passed mouth to mouth. They weren't actually gathered into a written collection until maybe 3 centuries after Aesop supposedly lived.
3 centuries, wow.
Yeah. And many different kinds of tales, jokes, proverbs, little stories, they came from all over. Some were older than him, some from outside the Greek world entirely. They just got attached to his name over time.
So his name became like a magnet.
Exactly. A magnet for this whole type of story. It became a kind of catch-all label. And believe it or not, that process still happens a bit today. New stories sometimes get added to the list.
That completely shifts things. So Aesop wasn't necessarily one single author creating everything.
It seems much more likely he was the figurehead, maybe even, like you suggested, a sort of brand name for the genre.
So what does that mean for understanding these stories, these fictions that point to the truth, as someone called them?
That phrase really gets to the heart of it. Apollonius of Tyana, a philosopher around the 1st century CE, he put it beautifully. He said Aesop made use of humble incidents to teach great truths. And he added something crucial. Aesop told the truth by the very fact that he did not claim to be relating real events.
That's a powerful idea. By not pretending it's real history, the story can reveal something deeper.
Precisely. Herodotus, the historian, mentioned Aesop was a slave. Plato even noted Socrates putting some fables into verse while he was in prison. But the modern view really leans towards this idea of a collective attribution.
Why? What supports that view?
Well, for one thing, the morals in the fables often contradict each other. And the stories about Aesop's own life, they vary wildly. It strongly suggests the name just became the default label when nobody knew the specific origin of a fable.
Okay, so if Aesop is more of a genre label, what actually defines a fable in this context? What makes a story an Aesopic fable?
Good question. Back in classical times, thinkers pointed out some key features. Fables needed to be short, sort of plain spoken.
Unaffected, right.
Yes, and, crucially, fictitious, not real history, but useful for life, and true to nature in a sense.
True to nature, even with talking animals.
Talking animals and plants are common, though some are just about humans. Structurally, you usually get a little introduction setting the scene, then the story, and often, bang, the moral spelled out right at the end.
But these weren't always just simple, straightforward lessons, were they? I mean, you mentioned political meanings earlier.
Absolutely not always simple. Context was everything. Take the frogs who desired a king, or the frogs in the sun. Those carried clear political commentary, often critical.
So they could be quite pointed.
Definitely. And some titles just became common sayings, part of the language. The goose that laid the golden eggs, the town mouse and the country mouse. We still use those. In fact, some scholars think stories like The Young Man and the Swallow were actually invented later just to illustrate proverbs that already existed.
Ah, interesting. Retrofitting a story to a saying.
Kind of. And they could also explain things what academics call an etiological function, like why is the ant supposedly a mean, thieving creature? Or how did the tortoise get its shell? There are fables for those.
And some were just funny.
Oh, absolutely. Some were just straight-up jokes. The Old Woman and the Doctor, for example, basically makes fun of greedy doctors. They had a real range.
Okay, this range, the political edge, the humor, it makes me circle back to their origins. If Aesop is a label and they weren't uniquely Greek, Where did they come from? Did they travel?
That's a huge question. The fact that we see contradictions, different versions of the same story, like the woodcutter and the trees, it all points back to Aesop being a general term.
Right.
And yes, many stories clearly have roots in West Asia. We find similar tales even further east. Modern research shows that fable-like stories, proverbs with similar structures, existed way back in ancient Sumer and Akkad.
Sumer and Akkad. How far back are we talking?
We're talking as early as the 3rd millennium BCE.
Wow.
Wow.
That's incredible. Thousands of years before Aesop's supposed time.
Yeah. It really changes the perspective, doesn't it?
Mm.
These narrative seeds are ancient.
What about other major storytelling traditions? India, for instance.
The connection to India is fascinating and, frankly, debated. Traditions like the Buddhist Jataka tales, the Hindu Panchatantra, they share maybe a dozen or so stories with the Aesopic collection,
Only a dozen.
roughly, that seem clearly related. But the details can be very different. There's been a lot of argument over the years. Some even tried to deny any Indian influence on Greek fables.
Really? Why?
Well, cultural pride, sometimes lack of evidence. But now, most scholars see it as a more complex picture. Maybe influence went both ways. The evidence is still emerging. It's not a settled case of A borrowing from B,
A two-way street or maybe multiple paths converging?
something like that. And it wasn't just Greece and India.
Where else did these influences show up?
Oriental stories definitely fed into the tradition, often through Jewish sources like the Talmudic and Midrashic literature. If you compare lists, some tales found in both Greek and Indian sources also pop up in Jewish texts.
And are they closer to the Greek or Indian versions?
Often, the Talmudic versions seem closer to the Indian ones. Take the wolf and the crane. In India, it's usually a lion and some other bird. Joshua ben Hananiah, a Jewish sage, told a version of this fable that clearly shows he knew an Indian-derived form, and he used it to make a specific point to his community.
It shows how stories get adapted for local purposes, doesn't it?
Perfectly. They're not static texts. They're living arguments, warnings, lessons.
So, okay, they traveled, they influenced each other across vast distances. How did they physically survive? How were they transmitted through centuries across all these languages?
The story of their transmission is almost as fascinating as the fables themselves. The very first Greek collection we know of was by Demetrius of Phalerum, back in the 4th century BCE. He apparently intended it for orators, people learning public speaking.
But that one's lost.
Sadly, yes. But later Greek versions survived, partially at least. There's Babrius. Around the 1st century CE, we have an incomplete manuscript with about 160 of his fables in verse. Those were crucial.
And then came the Romans.
Then came Latin. Phaedrus, who was actually a freed slave of Emperor Augustus in the 1st century CE, translated many into Latin verse. And later, Aphthonius of Antioch, a rhetorician, used them extensively.
So they became tools for education.
Very much so. This is key. Teachers of philosophy, rhetoric. They used Aesop's fables all the time as exercises,
Exercises for what?
discussing morals, practicing writing style, even grammar. Imagine students having to rewrite a fable or argue about its meaning. It embedded these stories right into the core of classical education.
So they weren't just casual reading.
Not at all. And then there's a figure named Romulus. We don't know who he really was, but his Latin prose collection from the 10th century with 83 fables became hugely influential across medieval Europe. It was a standard teaching text right up into the Renaissance.
It's a cornerstone of education for centuries. But when did they really break out into everyday languages, reaching people who weren't necessarily scholars?
That was the revolutionary moment. Around 1476, Heinrich Steinhol in Germany published his Aesopus. It was ambitious, aimed to be a complete edition, had Latin versions, German translations, and over 200 woodcut illustrations.
Pictures must have helped.
Immensely. And that book just set off a chain reaction. Translations popped up everywhere. Italian in 1479, French 1480, William Caxton's English version in 1484. Czech around 1488, Spanish 1489. And these weren't one-offs. They were reprinted again and again.
Making them truly widespread.
Exactly. And later on, you get famous writers like La Fontaine in 17th century France or Ivan Krylov in 19th century Russia, taking these basic stories and turning them into brilliant poetry in their own languages, giving them a whole new life.
We've talked about Europe and the Near East, India. What about further afield? How did they land in, say, the Americas or East Asia?
That's where the adaptability gets really amazing. Late 16th century Mexico, 47 fables get translated into Nahuatl, the Aztec language. And they didn't just translate, they adapted them, used local settings, Aztec ideas.
Wow, fables in Nahuatl.
Right. Then Portuguese missionaries take them to Japan. Result: the Aesop monogatari. And Aesop becomes so localized, he's practically presented as being Japanese,
That's incredible cultural blending.
isn't it? China saw translations in the early 17th century. Much later, in 1840, Robert Thom published a collection. It was popular for a while, but then the authorities banned it. Anti-authoritarian. Shows they still had that political edge. We also see translations across South Asia from the early 1800s into Burmese in 1880, even into Zulu in the 1960s, where the translator, Sebusio Nyembezia, swapped out European animals for ones familiar in southern Africa.
That adaptability is just stunning. They really can fit almost anywhere.
It seems so.
So these stories are incredibly flexible. Let's talk about some of the more maybe surprising ways they've been used and presented, going way beyond just books.
Well, originally, as we said, they were mostly aimed at adults, teachers, preachers, moralists. It was actually the philosopher John Locke in 1693 who strongly argued they should be aimed at children. He thought adding pictures would make them stick.
Ah, Locke. So he's partly responsible for them becoming children's stories.
He certainly pushed that idea, and you see these efforts. Pope Pius IV, back in the 16th century, commissioned Gabriel Ferno to create Centum Fabulae 100 fables in elegant Latin verse, specifically for kids, for their moral and linguistic development.
And what about that Versailles example? That wasn't a book.
Right. King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, had 38 fables built as hydraulic statues in the Garden Labyrinth at Versailles in the 1670s. Imagine walking through and seeing these stories physically play out with water features.
That's quite the interactive experience. So given this shift towards children and these different uses, how did that affect the way people understood their original point? Especially when it came to, say, religious ideas.
And that's a critical point, the constant reinterpretation. In classical times, fables sometimes touched on philosophical or even quasi-religious questions, like why are humans rational? Is there divine justice? They overlapped a bit with myth there.
But they got repurposed.
Radically. Take the lion's share. Originally, it's a pretty clear critique of tyranny, the powerful taking everything. But the Sufi mystic Rumi, centuries later, uses it as an Islamic parable about achieving oneness with God.
Complete transformation.
Totally. Or the hares and the frogs about despair and finding someone worse off. It gets used in Jewish fox fables to teach trust in God. Christians took The Wolf and the Crane and turned it into a lesson about saving a sinner's soul, even if it's risky.
And Martin Luther.
Even Martin Luther used them. During the Reformation, he wrote his Coburg Fables, adapting Aesop to push his own theological and social points. They became ammunition in religious debates.
So they're not just read, they're argued with, reshaped, and performed, it seems.
Absolutely. Performing them is key. La Fontaine's huge success in France really kicked off a trend for stage versions. Edmé Brosseau wrote Les Fables d'Aesop in 1690. It was a hit. Later adapted into English by John Vanbrugh. These plays often featured Aesop himself, using his stories to comment satirically on the society of the day.
Bringing the fabulous to life.
Exactly. And fast forward to the 20th century, you get animation. Paul Terry's Aesop's film fables, Jay Ward's cartoons like Aesop and Son, often playing them for laughs, spoofing the morals.
Making them relevant through humor.
There were even French fables géométriques, using animated shapes, and Japanese manga versions, and stage plays specifically for children, like Robertson Davies's Mask of Aesop.
Okay, plays, cartoons. What about music? Did the fables sing?
Oh, definitely. The musical treatments are just as varied. You have classical pieces like Charles Valentin Alkin's piano work, Le Festin d'Aesop from 1857, a set of variations.
How does that work musically?
Well, the variations often try to capture the mood or characters of different fables. Then in the 20th century, lots of composers wrote pieces for children's choirs or orchestras. Vincent Persichetti, Robert J. Bradshaw.
Using music to tell the story?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
Or using a narrator to introduce instruments representing characters. Daniel Dorff's 3 fun fables is that different instruments play the parts of the animal.
That sounds fun for kids.
It is. And it goes beyond classical. There are hip-hop recordings using fables, a rock opera by William Russo, even ballets, and Lefteris Cortis's Aesop project from 2010 blended jazz, classical East Mediterranean sounds with narration in English and singing in Greek.
Wow. Hip-hop to ballet, they truly cross all artistic lines.
It really shows their fundamental narrative power.
This journey through art forms is amazing, but maybe even more telling is how these stories got retold in very specific local languages, dialects, even slang. What's the importance of that?
If you think about it, it brings the fables right back to their roots, the oral tradition, the spoken word of a community. In Europe, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was this explosion of fables adapted into regional languages: Gascon, Limousin, Basque, Walloon.
Why then? What was driving that?
Often it was about asserting a local identity, pushing back against the centralizing power of the state and its official language. Taking La Fontaine's polished French versions, for instance, and translating them back into a more rustic regional dialect was a way of reclaiming them, making them folkloric again.
Making them theirs.
Exactly. And many of these adaptations weren't just translations. They became, independent works, weaving in local sayings, local references.
And this happened outside Europe too, right? You mentioned Nahuatl earlier.
Absolutely. Think about the French-based Creole languages in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, places like Martinique, Haiti. They developed their own vibrant fable traditions. Les Bambous in Martinique from 1846, Cric-Crac in Haiti from 1901.
What did fables mean in that context?
For those communities, often rooted in the experience of slavery, fables became a way to express their own culture, their resilience, their view of the world. Sometimes the Creole language could capture nuances of their experience in a way the master's language, the more formal French, couldn't. It was about cultural pride and commentary. And it continues. New adaptations came out of Mauritian Creole just a few years ago, into the C-17.
It's like the ultimate localization, making these ancient universal stories speak directly to very specific, often marginalized experiences. Did this extend into urban settings too? City slang.
It did. Another way to keep fables alive and kicking is to bridge that gap between formal written language and how people actually talk. So Roger Lestrange did this way back in 1692. He translated fables into what he called the racy urban slang of his day.
Huh. 17th century slangy fables.
You bet. And in France, after World War II, there was a real trend for translating fables into argot, the slang of Paris and other cities. These often weren't fancy books, but maybe little leaflets sold on the street or recordings by performers. It was about embedding these old stories right into the contemporary everyday language of the city, making them feel immediate again.
From ancient Greek assemblies to Parisian street corners, it seems these fables have been everywhere, adapted by everyone.
Pretty much, from political critique in antiquity to tools for teaching rhetoric.
To illustrated children's books, garden statues, religious parables.
To stage plays, cartoons, jazz compositions, and Creole folktales.
It's clear there's so much more than just those simple tales we might vaguely remember. They really are this incredible testament to how powerful stories can be and how we humans constantly use narrative to figure ourselves out, to understand our world.
Their constant reinvention across every culture, language, art form you can imagine. It just shows how deeply embedded these narrative structures are in us. They morph, they reflect the times, they teach differently depending on who's telling and who's listening.
Their adaptability is just astounding.
It truly is.
So maybe something for you, our listener, to think about. Is there a fable you remember, maybe one you thought was simple? How might it resonate differently for you now? And how could its core message, its little spark of truth, be retold or reimagined to speak to the unique challenges and complexities we face today?